On its journey to Seoul, South Korea, a Boeing aircraft carrying nearly 300 passengers unexpectedly deviated hundreds of miles off its original course, venturing deep into the Soviet Union's restricted airspace. This occurred during a period of heightened tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The looming threat of nuclear war kept the Soviet Union on maximum alert. Their defense systems were fully operational, and any unauthorized aircraft entering Soviet airspace, especially near Moscow, was likely to face catastrophic consequences. A race against time unfolded as the civilian aircraft unknowingly found itself pursued by powerful Soviet fighter jets. In the final moments, the opposing sides suddenly pulled back. The misunderstanding escalated to its peak, marking the start of one of the most controversial aviation incidents of all time. So, what really happened? Was it an orchestrated plan or deliberate error on the Soviet side? Let's dive deeper into the mystery of Korean Air Flight 007. 2 a.m., August 31st, 1983, Anchorage International Airport, Alaska, USA. A Boeing 747 had just landed at Anchorage International Airport to refuel, preparing for the next leg of its journey. This was Korean Airlines Flight KE-007, scheduled to travel from John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City to Seoul, South Korea. Due to the long journey, an intermediate stop in Anchorage was planned for refueling. The aircraft in service was a 5-year-old Boeing 747-230B, powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney JT9D7A engines, among the first jet engines that enabled large commercial aircraft to complete long-haul flights with high efficiency. On that day, 246 passengers and 23 crew members boarded the plane, most of whom were South Korean citizens returning home. The passenger list also included 62 American citizens, 28 Japanese citizens, 24 Taiwanese nationals, and individuals from various other countries. Among the passengers was a notable figure, Larry McDonald, a prominent Democratic congressman in the U.S. House of Representatives and chairman of the John Birch Society, an anti-communist conservative political organization. Reports initially suggested that former U.S. President Richard Nixon was seated next to McDonald. They were reportedly traveling to South Korea to attend the 30th anniversary celebrations of the U.S.-Korea Mutual Defense Treaty. However, 2 hours before departure, Nixon's assistant whispered something to him, causing a visible change in his expression. Nixon ultimately decided not to board the plane. 3 other congressmen who were also supposed to be on board canceled their flight at the last minute and took a different flight. The captain and commanding officer of the flight was 45-year-old Chun Byung-in. Chun, a former South Korean Air Force pilot, had accumulated 10,627 flight hours, including 6,618 hours on the 747. Joining him in the cockpit was 47-year-old First Officer Sun Dong-hwae. Like Captain Chun, Sun had also served in the South Korean Air Force. He joined Korean Air 4 years earlier and had amassed 8,917 flight hours, including 3,411 hours on the 747. Behind them, seated at the flight engineer station, was 31-year-old Kim Yui-dong. Kim had been with Korean Air since 1977 and had logged 4,012 flight hours, with 2,614 of those hours on the Boeing 747. At exactly 4 a.m., 35 minutes behind schedule, Flight KE-007 began its takeoff roll on runway 32. The Boeing aircraft moved forward slowly at first, then steadily picked up speed. 40 seconds after takeoff, Anchorage Air Traffic Control instructed the crew of KE-007 to turn southwest, aligning the aircraft with its designated route. The crew acknowledged the instruction and began a slight left turn to adjust their heading. Soon after, the aircraft ascended smoothly into the sky, embarking on its 8-hour journey to Seoul, South Korea. At 4:27 a.m., Anchorage Air Traffic Control instructed KE-007 to switch to the frequency of Anchorage Center for long-range control. The crew then received further instructions to fly directly to Bethel, a radio beacon located 373 miles westward. From Bethel, KE-007's planned route would take it over international airspace and then into Soviet airspace over the Sea of Okhotsk and the eastern Kamchatka Peninsula. However, there was an issue. The Bethel beacon was too far away and beyond the range of their radio navigation equipment. Instead of tuning into this beacon, the captain engaged the autopilot and set the heading selector to approximately 245 degrees, guiding the aircraft on a roughly accurate course toward Bethel. The crew planned to switch the autopilot from heading mode to navigation mode once they got closer. To put it simply, in navigation mode, the aircraft would automatically follow the pre-programmed route set by the pilots. Each time the plane reached a waypoint, it would turn toward the next point and continue until reaching its destination. This reduced the workload on the pilots, allowing them to monitor the flight's progress without having to make manual heading adjustments at each waypoint. In contrast, heading mode maintains only the selected direction without following the programmed route. This mode is typically used temporarily to avoid bad weather or to align the aircraft closer to the airport for landing. About 10 minutes later, another Korean Airlines flight, Flight 15, also en route from Anchorage to Seoul, along the same path as Flight 007, began its takeoff. This meant that the two flight crews could communicate via radio and accompany each other as they crossed the Pacific Ocean. At first glance, it seemed that both flights would follow the same path, but in reality, their routes were entirely different. No one knew that the flight paths of the two planes were diverging with each passing minute. After leaving Anchorage, Flight KE-007 veered north off course without the crew realizing it, possibly due to a misconfigured navigation mode or incorrect coordinates. By the time it reached the Navy waypoint, the plane was 60 nautical miles off its intended path. However, the pilots reported passing the waypoint without verifying the signal from the St. Paul Island radio beacon, which was a critical check per protocol. You may not know this, but at that time, the Soviet Union was on high alert due to missile tests. Scheduled to begin on September 1, they had also detected a USRC-135 reconnaissance aircraft near Kamchatka. Unfortunately for KE-007, it continued off course, without realizing that it was entering the buffer zone between US and Soviet airspace. As the plane approached Soviet airspace, Soviet military radar detected the presence of KE-007. Suspecting it might be a military aircraft, the Soviets immediately dispatched 4 MiG-23 fighter jets to intercept KE-007 as it entered their airspace. However, in the midst of this tense situation, the fighters unexpectedly ran out of fuel and had to return to base, allowing KE-007 to cross the international border without realizing it had narrowly escaped a dangerous pursuit. As the Boeing drew closer to Sakhalin Island, Soviet commanders went on high alert, preparing to respond to what they believed was a covert U.S. reconnaissance plane intrusion. At 8:45 p.m. Moscow time, a blip appeared on the Soviet military radar screen, matching the description provided by officers in Kamchatka, 35,000 feet and 485 knots. Immediately, 3 Su-15 fighters from Dolinsk-Sokol Air Base and 1 Soviet MiG-23 were ordered to take off to track the intruding aircraft. In the quiet darkness, the crew of KE-007 remained oblivious to the unfolding situation, flying forward without realizing that a deadly trap was being set. Within minutes, the fighter jets assigned to intercept reached their target from behind and to the right of the plane. With limited time, the Soviet pilots conducted a quick identification procedure instead of communicating via the International Emergency Frequency. The intercepting pilot attempted to flash his warning lights, but approaching from the rear, the signal went unnoticed by the civilian aircraft. He then fired warning shots, but they were armor-piercing rounds, unseen in the silent night. After all the warnings went unheeded, the Soviets concluded that this was indeed a USRC-135 reconnaissance plane. Amidst the confusion during identification and concerns that the aircraft might soon leave their airspace, the order to shoot down the intruder was given immediately. At this moment, what was happening in the cockpit of Agent 007? After receiving instructions from Tokyo Air Traffic Control to ascend to 37,000 feet, which was 2,000 feet higher than their current altitude, the pilots quickly entered the new altitude into the autopilot. Instantly, the plane began to climb, which consequently reduced its speed. The situation became more complex when two intercepting aircraft, unable to slow down in time, inadvertently overtook KE-007. The Su-15 pilot misinterpreted this as an evasive maneuver, believing that the opposing plane was attempting to target him with weapons. On the ground, Soviet commanders entered a state of extreme tension, believing that action was needed within seconds to prevent the plane from escaping into international airspace. The fragile peace aboard Flight 007 was now on the brink of an unimaginable tragedy. Then, the inevitable happened. The intercepting pilot received the order to press the missile launch button. 2 seconds later, he pressed the button again, confirming the attack order. In an instant, two K-8 air-to-air missiles launched from the fighter's wings, heading straight for the ill-fated intruder, Flight KE-007. The missiles struck the left wing of the plane, creating a violent explosion that shook the surrounding space. Passengers gripped their seats in terror, their eyes wide with panic. Shredded wing debris scattered, and shockwaves violently rocked the fuselage. Parts of the wing shattered, flying in all directions before being swept into the wind stream. Inside the cabin, chaos ensued as debris from the missile blast tore through the fuselage, leaving large holes. Pressurized air escaped at an alarming rate, sending loose items in the cabin flying. Oxygen masks dropped down, and frantic passengers clung to their seats, some being flung from their positions by the turbulent air currents. Screams blended with the loud roar of rushing wind, creating a terrifying scene like a living nightmare. The crew, stunned by the incident, struggled to comprehend what had just happened, desperately trying to maintain control in vain. In the cockpit, the pilots, bewildered, tried to understand what had occurred. The flight engineer quickly checked and confirmed that all 4 engines were still operational, ruling out an engine explosion. The pilots believed they were dealing with a sudden decompression incident, unaware that they had been struck by a missile. Neither the crew nor the passengers realized the horrific truth. The Boeing 747 had been attacked. They still believed they were on course to Seoul, following the familiar Romeo 20 route. However, after the explosion, the plane began an uncontrollable ascent. As the autopilot could no longer maintain stability due to a hydraulic failure in the tail, the captain attempted to lower the plane's nose, but his efforts proved futile. 3 out of the 4 hydraulic systems on the aircraft had lost pressure due to damage from the missile. The pilots now found themselves trapped in an out-of-control aircraft, climbing at a terrifying rate. If the plane continued to climb in this manner, it would quickly lose speed, enter a stall, and begin an uncontrolled descent. In the cockpit of KE-007, the pilots remained unaware that their plane was in danger due to external forces. 40 seconds after the missile attack, the aircraft reached 38,000 feet before its nose dipped and it began to descend rapidly. The first officer urgently contacted Tokyo Air Traffic Control to report the emergency. pilots desperately fought to regain control as the plane continued to descend. They attempted to slow the descent and stabilize the flight path, but the Boeing 747 was too severely damaged to be controlled. Just 104 seconds after the attack, both black boxes on the aircraft unexpectedly stopped recording data, leaving the subsequent events shrouded in mystery. The only confirmed fact is that the plane continued spiraling leftward, tumbling uncontrollably until it crashed into the sea 6 minutes later. Tragically, none of the 269 passengers and crew members survived in this disaster. Causes and investigation.
Korean jumbo jet off the coast of a Soviet.
The crash of KE-007 shocked the world, and the Soviet response only fueled further suspicion. The Soviet Union adamantly denied any responsibility, blaming the United States for orchestrating a sophisticated provocation scheme. As debates continued for years, the mystery surrounding the victims' remains remained unresolved. Some conspiracy theories even suggested that the Soviets destroyed the bodies to cover up evidence, sparking outrage among the victims' families, who formed groups to demand justice. In South Korea, people took to the streets, demanding an investigation into the cause of the tragedy. However, officials remained silent, offering no explanations. The secrecy surrounding the incident, coupled with the Soviet Union's refusal to disclose the crash location or release the black boxes or victims' bodies, led to a wave of criticism. It wasn't until 1992, during a meeting in Moscow, that the black box data was finally made public. Though it wasn't enough to quell public anger, shortly after the crash, despite Soviet efforts to conceal the facts, the world quickly realized that KE-007 had been shot down due to a misunderstanding. International politics were shaken, and unanswered questions continued to linger. Why did a modern Boeing 747-200 veer so far off course? A 1993 report from the International Civil Aviation Organization hypothesized that the pilot had mistakenly left the autopilot in heading mode after receiving clearance to fly directly to the Bethel beacon, forgetting to switch back to navigation mode. This theory became the most widely accepted explanation. Yet public skepticism persisted, particularly as details about the victims' whereabouts remained undisclosed. Amid Cold War tensions, the search and rescue operations suffered from a lack of coordination between the Soviet Union, the United States, South Korea, and Japan. While debris, luggage, and traces of remains were found, they remained unidentifiable. Another troubling theory suggested that the Soviets intentionally destroyed the bodies to hide evidence, suspecting that their true target was U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald, a staunch anti-communist. On the other hand, some defended the Soviet actions, arguing that they were merely protecting their territory from illegal intrusion, and that the United States was the true antagonist, exploiting South Korea for its own schemes. Why did KE-007 depart 35 minutes late from John F. Kennedy Airport? Did the CIA tip off Nixon and the congressman, prompting them to cancel at the last minute? Moreover, the pilots of KE-007 were highly skilled, making it unlikely that they would make such a critical navigational error. Another conspiracy theory claimed that only 26 people, including the crew and secret agents, were on board, and that the other passengers had been secretly relocated to safety by the U.S. The truth about this incident remains a dramatic and tragic puzzle with no clear resolution, even to this day.